got the Lenovo ThinkPad E14 G2 here. It's quite a compact 14-inch laptop with a Ryzen processor. So traditionally, if you think of ThinkPad, probably performance, robustness, good support, reliability, those things come to mind. But value for money is not necessarily the first. This is where usually the E series steps in. It's their more affordable ThinkPad lineup that still carries the ThinkPad sticker. We're hoping to get a sense how it stacks up. In short, it's a more modern chassis. You get really thin bezel, quite good design. The same ThinkPad keyboard. At the same time, it's not too heavy, so it's around 1.6 kilos. It's robust ThinkPad design on the surface, on paper at least. There's some catches. We'll go into that. Let's get started. The dimension this way and also that way is really close to the Carbon. Being nearly as compact as the X1 Carbon 8 is actually quite impressive for an entry-range product. Height difference is probably the most distinguishable difference between these two. Definitely very noticeable. The Carbon being more compact, of course. Let's not forget the Carbon is thinner and lighter. There's a reason why it's the portable flagship. Ports will be an area where there's some economizing. There's just one USB Type-C port. It becomes harder to try to charge the laptop and also use a USB-C device without an external dongle. Luckily, those dongles do exist. It's certainly not as elegant as having two USB-C. Two USB Type-A ports, one on each side, to HDMI 1.4 and audio jack. Very basic. On the other side, you have the USB 2 port, which is a little bit older spec than what you might typically imagine, and also the Ethernet port has this cover in place. Harder to use, always prefer to have an Ethernet rather than not having it. There's a lock slot. As you can probably surmise, the ports arrangement on this laptop is not the most generous, less optimal even for entry range. I suppose Lenovo wants to differentiate their offering. On the inside, the keyboard is quite reassuring to type on. It's really quick to get into it. What I would say, the travel is reasonably decent. I wish the feedback were a little bit more firm. It's perfectly fine to get started. Can tell that there's a very little flex. This is quite reassuring. The keyboard itself is not user serviceable. Motherboard is in the way. Wish it were user serviceable. I really like the response of the click buttons. They're slightly dampened. It's generally quite a joy to use. It doesn't get too clicky and is really precise. Same for the trackpad. It's a little bit dampened. Compared to something really clicky, I much prefer this interpretation. I think overall, if we push the lid slightly, it seems to be really firm. It doesn't have much give. Once you let it loose and it settles back into place quite quickly. That's quite nice. The speakers, they're downwards firing. Okay for the everyday workload. Wish they had a little bit more soundstage and bass, but I think it's a good starting point for a business system. Casing seems to attract the fingerprint marks fairly easily, as you can see. At least, thankfully, you can wipe off very easily with the microfiber cloth. Likewise, the base cover also very easily tracks the fingerprint. One-handed opening? Nope. I suppose if we really, with care, try to open it, but as you can see, the lid just doesn't seem to like it. So 2 hands or just 1 hand in the middle, or just do it with care, I suppose. On the base cover, there's 3 screws on each side and 1 in the middle. It's not the easiest cover to remove. Do take a look at the Lenovo hardware service menu. On the inside, you will see the dual heatsink heat pipe. That's quite nice. You will see 1 SSD 256. First impression, cute. The second slot is empty at the moment. 1 user accessible RAM under the metal shroud. 45 watts hour battery. Looking on the inside, the design seems to be quite tightly packaged. You will probably still see some spots of space. Once the metal cover has been removed, you will see 1 RAM slot. Once the RAM is installed, you're good to go. You will see this ribbon to the daughter board over here. If you had an E15, then this cable will be longer. I think this laptop shares the same motherboard with the larger E15. It's just that machine is a little bit stretched by comparison.
The speaker, one on either side, downwards firing, not as direct as some of the other ThinkPad, which has front-facing speakers. The base cover, it covers the side ports of the laptop, as well as just a base. If you think of something like the T14S, that cover comes off far more easily. There's much more detail. You have to take care to make sure that the clips on the front and edges, they don't come off. You can see the fan exhaust here in between. It's quite similar to some of the HP and Dell laptop designs. It's nice in the sense it doesn't require you to have a vent on either side of the laptop or the back of it. It becomes nice to exhaust the heat, not in your hands, by putting on either side of the laptop. At the same time, this laptop seems to dissipate more heat on top of the casing, which seems a little bit odd. On Heaven benchmark, which stresses both the CPU and GPU, you can see this part is quite hot, and also the center as well as the top left gets noticeably warm. Thankfully, part of the palm rise at least is not too toasty. When I was editing on Premiere, you can definitely feel the heat on the keyboard. By and large, the temperature seems to be okay. You can see that this part is reasonably cool, and the top part is also quite cool. This side gets a little bit more warm. Not quite symmetrical, I could, but it's fine to use it on the desk. Cold air goes in from the fan grill, then exhausted through either this gap from underneath or up just above the screen. Depending on how far you open the lid, sometimes it exhausts and over the screen a little bit more. If you're using it on your laps and have the display fairly widely open, then some of the air will exhaust onto your right knee, which is can be a little bit toasty. Running the battery test, the system runs a little bit cooler than before when we've seen it. This is still where some of the temperatures seem to be. It's more manageable than earlier. System is a little bit cooler than earlier when we were running Heaven benchmark, which was stressing CPU and GPU. This part, it's still where the heat is, but the base cover on the whole seemed cooler. Running the battery test, it took 3 hours and 40 minutes to drain to a third of the battery, so that equates to about 5.5 extrapolated hours, which is decent. The power usage is a little bit higher than what we've seen necessarily on some of the other Ryzen 5 laptops. Lenovo supports up to 24 gig of RAM on the system. As you can see, we've tried the 1x32 gig sticks. Obviously, having 2x8 is going to be faster in some workload, but if you do need capacity, there's a trade-off here. We've previously looked at some of this on the T14 video, so we're not going to go too much into this again. At least there's a USB-C port, so in theory, we can still charge the laptop through a dongle that supports the power delivery. So Lenovo charger goes into dongle splice it into the laptop, and as you can see, it's charging, which is good. The dongle supports VGA out. Also, the second dongle, because there's only one USB, so we need to expand that into more USB so I can actually use a mouse. I have to improvise slightly. Quickly taking a look at the spec, you'll notice that the actual top-end processor is not available in Europe and some other regions. This is particularly interesting because if you look at the next tier down, it's 8-core and 8-thread rather than 8-core and 16-thread. So it's not quite what you might expect. Of course, if we look further up, 16-thread down to 8. When you upgrade from this Ryzen 5 to this Ryzen 7, it's not across-the-board upgrade, but the Ryzen 7 would have a more powerful integrated graphic card. We've got the Ryzen 5, and we haven't seen much of the Ryzen. What I would probably say is when you look at which processor you're going to decide, it's partially going to be down to availability, and partially probably going to be down to the price. This varies quite noticeably between the regions. I'm sure that you'll find something that's powerful enough. We'll briefly take a look at the performance, and firstly, just to say, other people have already looked at the performance in quite detail, so we'll minimize this part. Firstly, the performance seems to be quite predictable, both AC and then also on battery. When you go on battery, you do get a degradation of performance, as you can see, going from those 3 modes onto the battery, but the battery mode seems to be surprisingly consistent when it's on the battery. The single core performance is right up there with the L14 with the high-end Ryzen 7, so that's what we're comparing against, so that's the effective potential it could have. And of course, looking at the benchmark, it seems that even the fully fledged Ryzen 7 model of the E14 G2 is not quite as fast as the L14. It generally looks like the Ryzen 5 is quite a decent option. If you can find the 12-threaded option, then that would be worth taking a look. On this laptop, I really like having the second SSD. I think that's going to be quite helpful. There's a slight area of improvement in terms of battery efficiency, which is when we look at the 855 from HP, the EliteBook G7, it's got a 20% larger battery, but then its battery life was estimated to be about 27 to 28% better than this laptop. It's not quite one-to-one linear relationship, so it means this laptop is a little bit less efficient. It's not much a margin, but hopefully Lenovo in the next generation could make it a little bit more efficient. On the RAM topic, I think for this generation, HP EliteBook G7 is something definitely to look at. For this generation of laptops, with the exception of ThinkPad L14, all the other ThinkPads seem to have slightly mixed implementation of RAM, for instance, onboard plus one slot, or something similar, or purely onboard, whereas HP has 2 slots, which both user accessible. So definitely worth looking at the HP. Just to say, this laptop is supposed to be like for like compared to a ProBook rather than EliteBook. So EliteBook would be a little bit higher tier, so that would be comparable to the T14, T14S tier. Anyway, we hope this is helpful. Any question? Just drop it in the comments.
Just a quick play with the webcam. So firstly, 2 lights in front of me. So it's considered quite well lit at the moment. If you look at the picture, so it's underexposing the video out of the box, absorbed into the chair. If it were a little bit brighter in the exposure, then I would probably be able to see more detail. At the moment, it looks really serious. You probably know this color. We're not sponsored by any of them. You can see this color on the screen. It looks a little bit more orangey. You all know this color. We're just finding familiar colors, objects at the moment out of the office that you probably know the color temperature of. So this pink distinctively on the screen is not as vibrant. This one, you can see it's underexposing slightly. Light green, really vibrant on the screen, looks a little bit darker and serious. Not a product placement. Pink bit in real life, it's more vibrant. Again, it's becoming a theme. The audio, if we move across a frame, I think it should be fine as well. There shouldn't be any sort of stutter. So as long as you're not too far away from the screen, I suspect it's probably fine. There's a fridge about 3 meters from me. It cancels some of the noise, I think, either that or didn't pick it up. Okay, so webcam part 2. So we're in work pod. It's a little bit less bright than before, but it's going to give an idea what it's like to use indoor in the kitchen, something similar, where it's lit, but it's not totally, completely immersively bright. Okay, so if you look at the hair, you will see that there's no specific focus in the image across a frame. You can just see the image and roughly see where it is. You can see the buttons, it's lit, but you can't really see much detail there. Right, so if we put it into presentation mode, so this is even less bright, and if I just hop over to across the sort of corner of the frame, I look like a ghost, less bright, and also less detail. The color, the saturation seems to go off a little bit. Going to be fine for your business conference call. If you want the next step up, there's always some external webcam.
You can see a slight ridge in the middle of the webcam cover. That's really where you need to put a fingernail to move it. A little bit more difficult to move than some of the other covers I've seen. It definitely works. It's good to have the privacy. Now on the inside, it's always quite nice to have a little bit thinner bezel. Most often than not, there's some trade-off, which is the screen becomes less serviceable as easily. As for the screen option, we're limited to the 220 TN panel and 250 nits IPS panel. It would be nice if there were a 300 nits or even 400 nits option. I think this is one of those areas where there's expected to be some trade-off in terms of the options. I suppose you can use an external screen. I'm conscious of pointing out flaws in the panels because they vary from panel to panel, so it's never quite the same. On this panel, on the top and on the bottom, you have some IPS glow on the screen. So I think that's normal to expect. Your panel may be a little bit better, or it might look just like this. And generally, the color is quite standard for 250 nits IPS panel. We've seen quite a few of these panels. So viewing angle vertically, it's good. And if we just look at the text and also the green, you can see very little degradation as we move across the screen in terms of viewing angle, which is quite nice. So it's not necessarily as bright a panel, but it's good that it's IPS still. So if we just try to close the lid, you can see on the edge, we can still see much of the text, which is quite helpful. It'd be nice in the future to have some ThinkPad with slightly higher refresh rate, for instance 120 Hz. I suspect those may appear in the higher end machines first.
In summary, the E14 G2 I think is a really promising product. In comparison to the predecessors, I think it's really come a long way in both the processor performance. You get a lot more power for the roughly the same money, and also the chassis, if you just look at it, it's quite clear-cut, thin bezel, more modern design. And of course, being the starter item, you wouldn't have all the trimmings of the more premium product lineups. The most obvious downside would be that you get fewer ports, so no Thunderbolt 3. You've actually got a USB 2 on this. Interesting. Fewer display options, so you can't go over 250 nits on the current configuration page. For some people that might be an issue. For some people just get an external screen. That shouldn't be too much, I think. Sometimes this machine ships with 12-month warranty rather than 2 years or 3 years on somewhat more premium range, so that's something to think about. If it's me buying, then a few questions I might ask myself is, what do I actually need this laptop for? The reason I said that is the specification, you can upgrade it quite a bit on this, but that also varies the price. So the idea with the entry range product is that with a good entry point, many people leave it at that point, but the more upgrades you do, the closer it gets to the T series and L series and also the X series pricing. All those laptops you can also upgrade. So if you think of adding, let's say, adding longer warranty, adding Ryzen 7 or bigger SSD, you actually find the price creeps up quite fast. In that sense, the sweet spot, I mean, I'd probably argue is Ryzen 5. Upgrade the RAM to 16, change the SSD as you need, but one thing I will definitely make sure I have is the IPS option. The next thing I'll ask myself is, do I actually need a business laptop? The reason I say this is usually consumer laptops are built for 1 to 2 years of usage, whereas business laptop is usually 3 to 5 years, so a little bit better build quality, but you also do pay the premium. So at that budget range, sometimes it's the case that you're better served with a more consumer-focused laptop, for instance, IdeaPad or a competing product from a different brand. Those sometimes have, slightly faster graphics or slightly better display, something that might suit you a little bit more. This laptop, as a business laptop, is a little bit light on business feature. It doesn't have those docking ports. For other features, it's generally quite well built. This is a funny thing I would probably consider. What are my other options? Sort of write it down on paper, so that way you have a better idea, it's articulated. At the moment, the mobile Ryzen, the supply is just a little bit limited. The laptop you actually get, it might not be the first one you want. It might be you already looked at a few other ThinkPad, the T series, it might be the L series, but those are not in a region, so you're looking at this one. This is a perfectly decent laptop. The price, it makes it a little bit less challenging to progress with, in the sense that if it's T14, you can definitely feel the premium in your wallet. You can't always make the perfect decision. This one, it's a fairly safe option. It's a solid, robust, and you get many features. Performance. It might be the case you spend less now on E series and upgrades to something better in a few years' time. It's still a ThinkPad, still helps you get things done. I think that's the things I probably have in my mind. Having said all that, it's important to go into this with the managed expectation. This is not your lightest or the fastest ThinkPad, but it's a perfectly decent ThinkPad with a lot of power. So with that in mind, if you're happy to accept that, then it probably, you'll probably really enjoy it. Anyway, thank you for watching.